Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to you for joining us for the seminar of Treatments and Color Terminology on GIA Colorstone Reports on the occasion of HKTDC Hong Kong International Jewelry Show 2025. The event will be conducted in English. To show our courtesy to the speakers, please switch your mobile phone to vibration mode during the event. Thank you for your cooperation. Today, we are very honored to have a GIA expert to discuss with us on the terminology utilized in GIA Colorstone reports. Without further ado, may I now invite our speaker to come on stage, Mr. Vertriest, Field Gemology Manager of Gemological Institute of America, GIA. Mr. Wim, please.
Thank you so much. Oh, everyone can hear me? That's great. Well, I first want to start with thanking all of you for coming here and taking time out of your busy afternoon, and also for the organizers to give us this wonderful event in the middle of the show. It's so nice to not be snuck in a back room somewhere. So it's very nice to actually be on the show floor and really be in the middle of all the gems and jewelry while we talk about gems and jewelry. So today I wanted to take a little moment to talk more about the GIA reports. So I think you guys are all familiar, hopefully, with the GIA reports. But over the last years, when I've been talking to people, I've come to understand that not everyone knows the terminology that we use on it. There are a lot of words that sound very complicated in there. What does it mean when a stone is clarity enhanced? What does it mean when a sapphire is royal blue? What's the difference between glass filling and heating with residue? So that's something that I want to explore today. What do these things mean that we provide on the report, and how can we interpret it? How can we better understand it? So that's the wrong direction. We've seen that one already. The first thing I want to discuss is a little bit about gemstone treatment itself. Because before we start discussing about what this treatment means, what that treatment means, I think it's important to just have a little discussion about the role of gemstone treatment in our fields. Because why do we do treatment? We don't do treatment because we like it. I think if we ask everyone, everyone prefers untreated gemstones. We all think we should only be working with the best of the best, the untreated gemstones. But the reality, unfortunately, is different. In reality, when we work in a ruby mine, we hope that by the end of the day, we get a handful of rubies like this, because that would be an amazing day working at the ruby mine. But in reality, if you spend your week working in a ruby mine, you get what is on the right. So there's a few stones that are amazing as they are, but a lot of stones need a little bit of help. They need a little bit of an upgrade. They don't come out of the ground perfect as they are. And it is there that treatment comes in. That is why we need treatment. Because if there is no market for the low-grade gemstones, for the stones that come out of the ground not perfect as they should be, if we don't have a market for those stones, for the second-grade material, we will never find the top-grade material. I think it is one rough dealer that explained it to me, that if you don't have a market for the 50 kilograms of brown garnets, you will never find the 1-carat ruby. So we need to have a market for all that material, and it is there that we can see those blue stones on the front. They are amazing, but they are actually a byproduct of all the greenish, more included material that we see in the back. And if we don't have a market for that material in the back, we will never get those attractive blue stones either. And it is there that treatment can help us upgrade some of that material that maybe initially isn't the perfect color, or initially it is a little bit included. And treatment can help us bring that to a nicer level and make it more attractive as it is. It can make the stone look prettier than the way it came out of the ground. So treatment is really necessary to keep the whole gemstone supply alive. Now, we all like to pretend that we only want to work with the top grade, the finest, the biggest, the cleanest, the untreated stones. The reality is that there is probably more money being made with glass-filled ruby than there is with Pigeon Blood ruby. That is unfortunately the reality of the trade. Treatment also provides us with a whole range of qualities and price points for the material. Not everyone can spend $100,000 per carat on a ruby, but all these people that can spend it also want to have access to rubies. So a treated stone that comes at a slight discount, that does not fetch that incredible premium, would be a great alternative for those people. Now, the only thing that I get upset about when we talk about treatment is when treatment is undisclosed. Treatment is an amazing thing. Treatment is probably the only reason why we are all still here. That is why we still have a gemstone trade around. Now the problem, and one of the reasons why we might not be here in 15 years, is undisclosed treatment. If we do treatment and we're not honest about it. That is the biggest no-no in the trade, and that is the biggest problem that we're facing right now. Because, let's face it, rarity is still an important factor, and untreated stones are rarer than treated stones. But on the other hand, some treatments need special care. You need to be aware of that. If certain stones with certain treateds are put through certain cleaning procedures, through certain manufacturing procedures, that could completely ruin the stone. And I will give you an example of that later during the talk. So again, disclosure is probably the most important thing. If you want to remember one thing from this whole talk, it is that undisclosed treatment is totally unacceptable. But treatment is probably the best thing there is for the gemstone industry. So that brings us back to the GIA reports. Now we know why treatment is important. Now we know why treatment should all be on our list, on our radar, and we should know about it. But how does GIA disclose that treatment? How do we put that on the reports that hopefully we all use day to day? And I'm going to start with emeralds. So when we look at emeralds, we focus mostly on clarity enhancement. Because if we look at rough emeralds, the color of emeralds, the way they come out of the ground, is usually spectacular as it is. The biggest problem that rough emerald has is the clarity. We can see that the color of all of these stones is amazing, but you can see that one on the right, it has some big cracks running through it. Those on the left as well, incredible clarity, but you can see incredible color, but they have a lot of fractures in them. So that is why clarity enhancement is the biggest thing for emerald. That is the point that we need to work on, that we need to upgrade, improve our emeralds a little bit. So what is clarity enhancement? Now, the emeralds that we see, they have surface-reaching fractures, and these fractures are filled with air. And the contrast between the air and that is in the fractures and the emerald itself, that is a very big optical contrast. That is why they are so visible. So basically, during clarity enhancement, we take a material, and we put it in the fractures. And that material has the same optical or very close to optical properties with the emerald. And that will almost completely hide the fracture, make it almost completely invisible. So that's what we're doing. We're taking the air out and replacing it with something with optical properties that are almost identical to the emerald. And that way, the fractures will become almost invisible. And I can show you what the impact of that could be, and I think why you also realize that it's important to tell your client about this. Because this is an emerald that has no filler in it. It has not been clarity enhanced. So we can see all the fractures there, and we can see all these reflections of the fractures, those big broad flashes. This is that same emerald after we clarity enhanced it. So this is the same stone. That is why disclosure is very important. But that is also the impact that clarity enhancement could have. Because let's face it, if I give the stone on the left to my girlfriend, I'll probably be sleeping on the couch. But if I give her the one on the right, she'll be very happy and we'll go on a vacation together. Because that stone is just way more attractive. It is much more beautiful. It will have a buyer readily available. But it is important to say, take care of it, because this stone has been clarity enhanced. Now, what matters during clarity enhancement? When GIA looks at clarity enhanced stones, what are the things that we look at? The first thing that we need to take into account is the amount of fissures. Because obviously, if there's only a small fracture that's clarity enhanced, or there's 20 big ones that are clarity enhanced, that is important to make that difference. Because that stone on the top that only has a tiny fracture, that is much rarer than a stone with all these big fractures on the bottom right. So it's important to make that distinction. The quantity, how many fissures are filled. And then the second part is which material is used to fill the fractures. And I'm going to focus on that specifically in about 5 minutes. So first, the extent of clarity enhancement. How much filler is present? Because emeralds with fewer fractures, they are rarer. So that is also a value thing, that a stone with little clarity enhancement is a lot rarer than a stone with a lot of clarity enhancement. On top of that, a very fractured emerald, you can fill it with material that almost acts like a glue, that will basically hold pieces of emerald together. Now that is very important to know, because if you take that material out, your emerald might break into 2, 3, 50, 100 pieces. So in that point, disclosure is very important. So the amount of filler that we can detect, but also how many fractures are there? Is it one tiny fracture, or is there 5 big ones? Is it one tiny one under the table, or is it a tiny one next to the corner? So the position of those fractures is also taken into account. So we grade that, and we basically have 5 rankings, and I'm going to go through that. And the first one is probably the most rarest one. I don't think I've seen more than 5 stones that qualify like this. That is an emerald without fractures to begin with. So even if you wanted to clarity enhance it, you couldn't, because there are no fractures for an oil or a resin or a wax to go into. So if an emerald with no fissures present, that would be noted on the report. Then we have an emerald with no or insignificant clarity enhancement. So that is a stone where we see fractures, where you could put oil in there, but there is no oil or resin in there. So that is the second one, with no indications of clarity enhancement. And then we have the stones where we detect clarity enhancement. So that is a terminology that is adopted among most of the laboratories and is very consistent there. Our good friends from GIT, from SSCF, from Gubelin use the same kind of categorization, where we separate between minor, moderate, and significant, F1, F2, F3, based on the presence of the fracture, the location of those fractures, but also based on how deep are those fractures, how wide are they. Basically, it comes down to what is the difference between this stone in the current treated state and the difference between that stone in an untreated state. If we take all the clarity enhancement out, how big would the difference be? If the difference is very minimal, it would be a minor. If the difference is pretty big, it would be a moderate. If the difference is going to be enormous, it is going to be a significant. So that is taken into account, like how different would this stone look before treatment and after the treatment that we currently see. So when that gets mentioned on the report, we can see that if we, on a GIA report, we would have a natural beryl, an emerald. In this case, the geographic origin is not requested. But under the treatment section, it would say clarity enhanced F1. And at the bottom, it has that scale where it says that F1, that refers to minor. If it is an F2, that will refer to moderate. If it is an F3, that will refer to significant clarity enhancement. Now then, I want to talk about something new. This is something that GIA only launched a couple of weeks ago in mid-December, where we started identifying the material that is being used to fill. So what we talked about now, that is irrelevant of what is in the fractures. That is just how much is there and what is the impact of that material. But people also want to know which material is being used, because we can use a number of materials. And we can see here, I mentioned that the optical properties, the refractive index, is very important. And I've listed here, you can see an emerald is about 1.56 to 1.59. And around it, you can see a lot of very commonly used materials. And you can actually see that cedarwood oil, which a lot of people think is the best thing, there's actually quite a big difference between cedarwood oil and emerald. So cedarwood oil is actually not a very good product to oil emeralds with. It does not do a very good job at clarity enhancement. But also I want to add at the bottom that people ask, why can't you put glass in there? Because glass would be a lot more stable, a lot more harder, a lot more difficult to remove, a lot more chemically resistant, heat resistant than oils. Why can't you put glass in there? And I think here you can see, because the difference in optical properties between a glass and an emerald is way too big. So an emerald would do a terrible, glass would do a terrible job at hiding a fracture in an emerald. Glass would do a terrific job at hiding a fracture in a corundum, but we're going to talk about that in 10 minutes. So what we do at GIA is this filler ID, and we filler ID that because the first reason we want to know it is not every filler is as stable. Some of these fillers degrade, some of these fillers change color over time, they start breaking down, and also there is in the trade a preference for some people towards a resin, because a resin tends to be more stable, harder, does a better job at masking the fractures. And then there is also people that prefer oil because it is seen as more traditional, but traditional doesn't always mean better. Whatever your reason is, GIA separates it now in two categories, where we have our type A fillers, which would refer to oils, waxes, natural resins, and things like that. So things like baby oil, mineral oils, balsa oil, cedarwood oil, paraffin, that would go into that type A group. So these are natural products or products with a natural equivalent that are very often in a liquid state at room temperature. Then we have the type B filler. So these are artificial resins, very often specifically designed industrial products for this purpose. So very often they do a very good job at clarity enhancing, and they tend to be a lot more stable. So things like Palma, Opticon, PermaSafe, which are sometimes two different products that are mixed together, where it is one product put in and then another product added to stabilize it with using UV. These are artificial resins that we would classify as a type B filler. And then there's obviously cases where we see both of them mixed, where people maybe put a type B resin in first and then put a little bit of oil on it, just so they can say, yeah, it's actually just been oiled. So that is something that we actually rarely see. We will only call it type A plus B if these are roughly the same degree, because usually there is one type very clearly dominant, and we would call it that dominant type. So when that gets put on the report, you can see that we just add that line in the treatment section. So this is still a natural beryl, it is still an emerald, in this case it is a Russian stone, but under the treatment it would say it is clarity enhanced F1, so that referred to how much treatment is there in the stone. And then we have that second line where we say the treatment material that is used, the clarity enhancement product, is a type A material. So that could be a cedarwood oil, a paraffin wax, or things like that. So that is how that gets stated on the reports right now. So that is included with any Emerald service as of today, actually as of mid-December. And for now, this extra service is free of charge. That might change in the future, but this is something that is, upon request, added to any Emerald report right now. So to summarize the Emerald treatments, I want to say that most emeralds in the trade have been clarity enhanced. It is a very common thing. Now what matters there is quantifying the extent of clarity enhancement. How many fractures are clarity enhanced? What is the relevance of these fractures? So that is where we have that none, if there is no clarity enhancement, or there aren't even fractures to begin with. And then we have that minor, moderate, significant, F1, F2, F3, for the extent of clarity enhancement in the stone. And then recently, GIA also started identifying these fillers as either type A or type B, that being either the oils, natural materials, waxes, versus those artificial resins that are specifically made with clarity enhancement of gemstones in mind. So that's that type A, type B, that is a different level than that F1, F2, F3, which has to do with the clarity enhancement amount versus the clarity enhancement style. But both of these are mentioned on the GIA reports now. So that brings us to the next big stones. That is ruby and sapphire treatment. And in ruby and sapphire treatment, there are a number of challenges with rough that comes out of the ground. Because we saw with emeralds, it is mostly focused on the clarity. There aren't really any treatments that can help you improve the color of an emerald. Now, the color of an emerald can look better after clarity enhancement, but the actual emerald color hasn't changed because of it. For ruby and sapphire, that can be a whole other deal. Now, the first case we have to discuss is obviously an untreated stone. An untreated stone will have that listed under treatment where it says no indications of heating. Now, how do we detect that? That is mostly based on the fact that the inclusions, the impurities in a stone, for example, the crystals that we see there, or those needles, that they are completely unaltered. They are in a pristine state. You can see that those needles are beautifully long, elongated. Those crystals have a very nice outline, transparent appearance, completely pristine. They have not been altered by any process at high heat. Now, we can put these stones in a furnace, and heat treatment can happen in a number of different ways. So here are 3 heat treatment styles that are still occurring today, with the one on the top left being the most traditional one. This was already described more than 800 years ago, but people are still using the same technique where they're using blowpipes and charcoal to improve the color of sapphires. Then we have the one on the top right, which started happening about 50, 60 years ago, where people are using fuels that could be diesel, kerosene, charcoal, to get a higher temperature and increase the burning temperature, getting a more drastic effect. Nowadays, most of the treatment happens in a furnace like this, which is an electric furnace with a heating element that has a lot of advantage. You can basically set the temperature, and as long as it's plugged in, it will hold that temperature. The one on the right, it is when your gas runs out, the burn is over. If you want it at 400 degrees or at 600 degrees, it is very difficult to control that. The furnace on the bottom, you can set it at 1648 degrees, and it will be 1648 degrees. So that is why a lot of people still prefer that furnace as well. But there are still people that are using the traditional burn, because that picture on the top right is a picture I took 6 months ago. So people are still doing it that way. Now, what is the reason? Why would you heat treat rubies or sapphires? And I've taken this stone because this stone has a heat treatment being done for it for 2 reasons. We can see that it is not the most attractive blue color. There is a slight hint of blue in it, but it is not beautiful blue. On top of that, it is very cloudy. It has very low transparency. So with corundum, there's 2 challenges that we need to face. We need to deal with that clarity, so improve the cloudiness or the fractures in it, and then we want to improve the color as well. And with heat treatment, we can do both, because this is the other half of the stone, where we can see that the color has drastically improved and the cloudiness is completely gone. So we were able to turn that milky, cloudy, whitish stone into a very beautiful, transparent blue pebble. So that is the 2 main reasons why we do heat treatment on rubies and sapphire. Now, detecting that often relies on the inclusions again, where we can see that the inclusions are completely different from what we saw in those untreated stones, because these are very similar inclusions. The inclusions here on the left, we can see they are no longer transparent. They are completely turned frosty, and they are what we call now a snowball inclusion, because they look like these little fluffy white clouds, completely degraded by that high heat that they have been subjected to. The one on the right, if you squint your eyes a little bit, you can see that there's still those resemblance of a needles in there. We can still see those patterns like this and like this and like this in there. But those long needles that used to be beautiful strands of what we call silk are now completely broken up. They are what we call peppered. So they're completely broken up in these little pieces, completely degraded. Very classic sign of a ruby or a sapphire that has been heat treated at high temperatures. So when we detect something like that, we would put that on the report as under the treatment as heated. So it is still a natural stone. It could still be a ruby or a sapphire. We could still do the origin determination on it, but that stone would have a heated comment under the treatment section instead of a no indications of heating. Now that is when we only see an improvement in the color. I mentioned already that there are sometimes issues with clarity as well, especially when it comes to the fractures there. So when we deal with the fractures, there are 2 main treatments that I want to discuss. And some of these treatments are known under different names. So I talked about the first one that I referred to as flux healing, but it is the same as heating with residues. It is the same as borax treatment. In Thailand, they call it pau mai. Then there is also the glass filling. The lead glass filling, or the Paukai, the new treatment. So those are two different treatments with the same goal in mind, and that is working on the fractures in your corundum, trying to mask the fractures there. So we're going to start with the first one, and that is heat with residue with flux. And it is actually a very complex process that happens there, but basically by adding flux, by putting flux into your fractures, you are able to heal your fractures completely. But of course, healing is never perfect. We have the same thing. When we cut ourselves, it won't stay bleeding forever. That cut will heal, but there will be a scar there. So it is these scars that we look for when we look for heated with residues. And actually, that residue part in that heat with residue explanation, that residue refers to the scars that we see in the ruby there. And this is what is left. So this used to be a completely open fracture. This used to be filled with air. But now you can see that there is only these droplets of flux that remain, that is the scar, but most of it is actually filled with corundum now. So it has the same hardness, it has the same durability, it has the same chemical resistance as the rest of the corundum. That is completely healed, and we are only left with that scar where that fracture used to be. Now, of course, it matters how many of these scars we see, how many of these healed fractures we see. Because same thing as with emerald, if there's only one fracture that used to be healed, that material is much rarer than one with 100 fractures that have been healed. So we use the same classification there, that minor, moderate, significant. And you can see some visual examples here, where here there is some very subtle scarring here, but on the right we can see the scar is very big, very coarse. There's a lot of them out there. So that's the difference between that minor, moderate, and significant residue in your fractures of your heated ruby. So when we mention that, that is still a natural corundum, that is still a ruby. We could still do origin determination on it, but in the treatment comment it would say heated with minor residues, or heated with moderate residues, or heated with significant residues, depending on how many of these healed fractures we will see in the ruby. Most of the time, this is a process that is applied to rubies. Now then we have another process, a process that a lot of people frown upon, but I think it's very important to recognize, and that is lead glass filling. Now, lead glass filling is very interesting, because it is not a complex scientific treatment. The easiest way I can explain it is, you have a ruby with a hole on it, you just stick the hole full of lead glass. Problem solved. That is what's happening during lead glass filling. So basically at this higher temperature, that glass will melt, it will go into the fracture, it would solidify there, and then it will completely hide the fracture. Now obviously that has some drawbacks as well, and this is very important to disclose, because a treatment like this, here we can see one of these lead glass filled fractures, that is glass that we put in the fracture, that is not corundum. And that glass has typical glassy features. It has gas bubbles in it, like we see in a lot of glasses. So that's how we can recognize it, where we see all these gas bubbles. On top of that, the refractive index, the optical properties of the glass and the corundum, they're not 100% the same. And how do we know they're not 100% the same? Because where they touch, where the corundum and the lead glass touch on the side of the fracture, we see these slightly colored flashes. So we see these blue lines running through it. Sometimes they're green, sometimes they're yellow. And these can be very obvious. Sometimes in a lead glass filled stone, even if you look at it like this, you sometimes see a very suspicious blue flash or a green flash in it. That is the lead glass filled fracture that you can see in there. But even with a loupe, this is probably the easiest treatment to detect. So when that gets put on a report, that is still a natural corundum, that is still heated because this process only happens at high temperature, but it will say that it is clarity enhanced with lead glass. So this is actually the same process that we do in emerald, just with a material that is suitable for corundum, in this case lead glass. But it does come with this statement that this fracture filling material may be unstable at higher temperatures and to chemical agents, and special care should be taken when cleaning or repairing jewelry with these stones. Because, for example, if you put a stone like this to the jeweler's torch, a corundum, a ruby or a sapphire does not care. But the glass inside those fractures will care. That will get altered, will even melt and leak out. So it is very important to notice, even as a jeweler, if you put this through aggressive jewelry cleaning products, which would have no effect on your corundum, on your ruby and sapphire, they can have a very big impact on the glass that is used to repair, to clarity enhance these stones. Now, how far can you push that? How much glass can you put into a ruby? And the answer is very, very far. Because you can see here that we have literally small pieces of ruby floating in a mass of glass. So that is material where there is more glass than ruby in there. And that is important to recognize it as well. Because this is a material, this is a stone like that was brought into a friend of mine's jewelry store where he said, I got this from my grandma, this is my Pigeon Blood Burmese unheated ruby. And he said, boy, do I have bad news for you. Because he asked, okay, this is not what you think it is. Can I test this? Can I destructively test this? So he put this in the jeweler's pickle, standard used solution in any jeweler's workshop. And this is what came out after a couple of hours. So this is why it is so important to be able to recognize lead glass filled material. I'm not telling you to ignore it. I'm not telling you to stay away from it. I'm just telling you to be aware of it. Because it is probably the easiest recognizable treatment, but the mistake that you make for not recognizing it is enormous. Now, obviously, when a material like this comes through the GIA laboratory, we will no longer call it a natural ruby. A piece like this that would just crumble if you take the glass out, that would get called a manufactured product. And it comes with that disclaimer that this is a product that consists of ruby and lead glass, where these two things are mixed together and later faceted. So that, again, you can push it as far that these things actually become a manufactured product and are no longer considered a natural ruby with treatment. They become a manufactured product. Now, another thing that we can do with corundum is create extra color in it. We can heat it with extra elements in it, with extra elements added to it, and these extra elements will create extra color in our corundum. I'm going to go through this very fast because we know that in blue sapphire, for example, most of the color is created by iron and titanium. In ruby, it is because of chromium. But that iron and titanium, we can play around with it, and we can actually stuff other elements in there that will interact with it. So one of the most impactful treatments is what we call beryllium treatment, beryllium diffusion, which started happening about almost 25 years ago and really made big waves in the market. Because if you force beryllium into a corundum at high temperatures, it will turn material like this into material like this. So about 25 years ago, I wasn't in the industry yet, but all of a sudden, there was a lot of patparacha coming into the trade. So orange colors, yellow colors are very easily created by putting beryllium into your corundum. Again, nothing wrong with it as long as it is disclosed, because this treatment is stable, but a lot of the material has not been used, has not been disclosed. But I also want to tell you that most people that are aware of beryllium diffusion focus very heavily on the yellows and the patparachas, the oranges. But I'm here to tell you that in all of these stones, I have seen beryllium diffusion. We have seen beryllium diffused rubies, blue sapphires, pink sapphires, purple sapphires, green sapphires. It is a possibility in any kind of corundum. But most of it is going to be the yellows and the oranges where we have to be most cautious. Now, another topic of controversy is how do we detect this? Because this is a procedure that happens at very high extreme temperatures, very high heat. So it is obviously going to have a big impact on the inclusions, but not every stone that is treated at extreme conditions is treated with beryllium. You can just put a stone at very high temperature without adding beryllium. So the only way of detecting beryllium diffusion in a ruby or a sapphire is to measure the actual beryllium. There is no indication in the inclusions, in the color zoning, in the FTIR spectra, in the UV-Vis spectra that you can use. The only way that you can detect beryllium in a corundum is by measuring the actual beryllium in the corundum. So at GIA, we use an instrument that is called LAICPMS, laser ablation inductively coupled mass spectroscopy. That is not going to be on the test. But it is a very fancy, very high-tech piece of equipment where we basically analyze your ruby or your sapphire by burning a super tiny small hole on the girdle of your stone. The material we burn out gets pulled through this entire big machine, and we are able to detect chemical elements down to the size of 1 part per million. Now that is the equivalent of finding a stamp on a football field. That is the equivalent of going to New York City, and I give you a list of 10 people, and you've got to find those 10 people in New York City. That is 1 part per million. So that is the concentrations we are able to detect. And why do we need that good of equipment? It is because 1 part per million, 2 parts per million, 3 parts per million is enough to change your corundum from completely colorless to a bright orange. So it's that little material, that little treatment that can actually have a huge impact on it. Now, I saw a lot of people getting very scared when I said we burn a little hole in the girdle of your stone when we do this testing. This is what that looks like. So this is the girdle of a round sapphire that is only a 4 millimeter round, and this is the size of the burn hole. So that is thinner than a human hair that we burn out. But that material is enough for us to detect if there is beryllium in it or not. Now, when we detect that, we will list that as a beryllium diffused stone. So under the treatment section, it will say beryllium diffused. Once a stone has been beryllium diffused, we often cannot issue an origin on it anymore because it has been so intensely treated, it has been so mangled through the inclusions that we can no longer issue an origin there. Now that brings us to the last part, and maybe the most interesting, most controversial part for a lot of things, because I recognize some faces who were at a talk earlier this week about describing color in gemstones and basically saying why that is a terrible and very difficult idea. Despite it being a terrible thing to do and a very bad idea and very challenging, GIA needs to make an effort because there is a lot of questions about it from the trade for these specific color calls. So I'm going to explain to you now how we approach this. How do we issue a Pigeon's Blood call on a ruby? How do we issue a royal blue call on a sapphire? So this has nothing to do with treatment. These are special color terms that the trade thinks are important. So the first thing I want to discuss is when we look at the color of gemstones, it is important to do that in a neutral lighting environment. I am wearing the worst suit ever to grade blue sapphires because everything right now is going to look 10% better. If you wear a red jacket while you're grading rubies, your grading is going to be useless because they're all going to look better. That is why a neutral background, a neutral environment is very important. That is why in laboratories, almost everyone uses one of these standard gray boxes where the backgrounds, the sides are all the same color. That is why your tray where you grade stones is a neutral white and it is not pink or blue or purple because it would just skew the color of it completely. The second thing is we want to look at it in consistent light. And I think a lot of us are familiar with it. If we look at the same stone in the light here inside or outside, it's going to be completely different. If I look at the same stone in Hong Kong or in Paris, it is going to look different. If I look at the same stone in the morning outside or in the evening outside, it is going to look different. Now, obviously, that is a complexity that we cannot navigate. We cannot simulate that in the lab. So we choose, this is where we set our benchmark. This is the standard environment we use. And we know that that doesn't always translate exactly to where you see gemstones in the wild. This is not how we look at stones in the show. This is not how you sell gemstones. But it is a very convenient, practical alternative to look at color. Now, when we look at pigeon's blood, there are a couple of things that we require. So in theory, it needs a pure red intense color, and it needs strong fluorescence under long wave UV. Another point is, it is not relevant what the origin is. Pigeon's blood has nothing to do with where a stone comes from. It is 2025, it is about time we get rid of gemstone racism. We're not doing that anymore. If a stone comes from Burma, if a stone comes from Thailand, if I walk outside here and I dig a hole in Victoria Park in Hong Kong and I find a ruby with this color, we will call it pigeon blood. The other thing is that treatment is not really an issue. A heated stone can be pigeon blood. A stone heated with residue can be pigeon blood. Now, when a stone gets glass filled, it no longer qualifies for a pigeon blood. When a stone is diffused, it no longer qualifies for this terminology. But a heated stone, a stone heated with residues, is no problem. Also, the cut is irrelevant. Clarity and cut is not a thing. This is a color thing, not a cut or clarity thing. So how do we confirm this? We check this with master stones. So we have a set of stones where we can compare your stone that comes into the lab. So we put that in that standard box I showed you, and we can compare. If it is lighter than this stone, it is no longer pigeon blood. And if it is darker than this stone, it is no longer pigeon blood. If it is more purple than this stone, it is no longer pigeon blood. If it is more orange than this stone, it is no longer pigeon blood. And now I'm gonna do something crazy that I'm gonna trust all of you. And why do I trust all of you? Because you're all smart people. I'm gonna show you the master stones that GIA uses. And everyone's gonna promise me that they're not taking a picture of it, because you guys are all smart enough that you will be taking a picture of a picture of a picture on a terrible screen that will have zero value for you. So if you take a picture of it and I see you use it to compare a stone to, I will come and find you and you will get a good scolding. I'll keep it civil. So these are the master stones that GIA uses. So the first requirements we've got to check is, does it have a pure red intense color? And the lighting's not great here, but I think we can all agree those two stones on that side, they get a little bit of purple. They're still beautiful, but these stones are disqualified because they don't match that pure red intense color. Now then we also need that strong fluorescence. And we can see that those three stones on the left here have a beautiful red color, but their fluorescence is not strong enough. So these three stones are disqualified based on their fluorescence, which basically leaves us those four stones in the middle as being pigeon blood for GIA. Because those stones on the right, while their fluorescence is strong enough, the stones were a little bit too purple. The stones on the left, while their color is very beautiful in daylight, their fluorescence wasn't strong enough for a GIA pigeon's blood call. So when we put that on a report that is obviously a natural ruby, I think here you have proof that these stones can be heated with residue, and it will have that comment section where it will say the color appearance of this stone is described in the trade as pigeon's blood. So those are the requirements that we have. Now if we look at royal blue for sapphire, what we require for royal blue is that it needs a pure, rich blue color faced up, with an even distribution when we face it up. Because there's a lot of sapphire experts in the audience here, and I think you all know that color zoning in sapphire is a very common thing. If you flip a sapphire upside down, you very often see white bands running through it. Now the important thing is that when you look at it face up, because that is how we look at gemstones, it needs to be a consistent color. You can flip it around and it can have the biggest blue bands, colorless bands running through it. If it faces up an even blue, it is the right color. Again, this is not origin dependent. This is not exclusively for Sri Lankan stones, not exclusively for Madagascar stones. If it has the right color, it doesn't matter where it's come from. Like I said, gemstone racism, we're not doing that anymore. The other thing is, again, the same as pigeon's blood. The treatment is not really relevant. It can be heated with residue. Again, when it becomes glass filled or it's a diffused stone, then they get excluded from it. So for rubies, a lot of them get excluded because of glass filling. For sapphires, a lot of them get excluded because of diffusion. Again, the cut, the clarity is irrelevant. As long as the color faces up in an even way, that is okay. Now, how do we check this? We confirm that with the masters. So here are our masters again. Again, no need to take a picture because you'll be taking a picture of a picture of a picture in terrible light. But we can see that the stones on the right, they are a little bit on the lighter side. Absolutely beautiful. And the stones on the left, they are a little bit on the darker side. So they are not that rich, beautiful blue that we want from a royal blue. So only those 3 stones in the middle would qualify as a GIA royal blue. So to wrap that up, on a report, it would say again in the comments that the color appearance of this stone is described in the trade as royal blue. That's how you would recognize a GIA royal blue. So to wrap that up, for summary calls, origin is irrelevant. That's the first point I want to make there. Heat treatment status is also irrelevant, with the exception of diffusion and glass filling. And then probably the most important thing is master stones are critical for setting boundaries. And these master stones, you need those because you cannot compare corundum with a piece of paper. You cannot compare coloring corundum with a piece of glass. So you need to compare corundum with corundum. Apples with apples, pears with pears. Your master stone needs to be the same material as the stone that you're looking at. You can't compare it with a slice of paper, you can't compare it with a chip of paint, you can't compare it with a piece of cloth, doesn't work. And then the last point that I just want to bring up is that chemical analysis is irrelevant. And I think in the talk that we heard earlier this week, where there was a lot of talk about describing color, the amount of chromium in a stone has nothing to do with the fact that it's pigeon blood or not. The amount of iron in a sapphire has nothing to do with the fact that it is royal blue or not. Nobody talks in these percentages because there is so much more to it. So chemical analysis is not part of your color determination. So with that, I want to wrap it up. If you guys have any questions, we can answer those at the GIA booth. That is, if you go out that way from the hall and you take a right, you'll see us right there. Because I don't think we'll have a lot of time to answer questions here, because there is a very important other panel coming up that I absolutely want to make room for. But I think we have time for questions at the GIA booth or here at the back. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining. I hope you learned something. I hope you don't have many questions left, but if there are questions, we're very happy to answer them here, or you can reach out to us through any of the social media or through email in the Hong Kong laboratory here. Thank you so much for joining and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Wim. Please give a round of applause to our speaker today. Thank you very much for wonderful sharing today. And if there's any questions from the floor, please feel free to visit GIA booth at 3.173. On behalf of HKTDC, I would like to thank again Mr. Wim Vertriest to be the guest speaker for us. And I would also like to thank everyone for joining us today. We have now come to the end of the seminar session, taking place here again at 3:30 p.m. Today is a seminar titled Striving for Sustainability and Trust Marking via ESG and ISO certification. You are most welcome to join. Thank you.
Necklaces of starlight wrapped around my soul. Precious moments making me whole. Symphony of sparkles shining bright. Jewels of the night taking flight. Hear the melody in every chant. Let the dazzling rhythm begin. Rubies like fire, burning with love, emerald whispers from above. Sapphire dreams in